The photograph surfaced in the Boston City Archives during a routine cataloging of unmarked boxes, thin cardboard containers filled mostly with tacks, records and building permits from the early 1900s. Archivist Eleanor Whitford had opened the final box expecting nothing remarkable. Instead, she found a single envelope labeled only Market District, 1909. Inside it, wrapped in brittle tissue, lay the sepia print that would ignite a far deeper investigation than anyone in the department expected. At first glance, it appeared to be just another street document of Boston's bustling Haymarket Square. Produce stalls arranged neatly along the sidewalk, vendors bundled in wool coats against the winter cold, and the heavy brick facade of the main public market building looming over the scene. But the longer she looked at it, the more she sensed a stillness at odds with the market's reputation for constant motion. Something in the composition felt deliberate, almost staged. Eleanor brought the photograph to the archive's small reading room, adjusting the lamp to catch the grain of the paper more clearly. The building in the image had been demolished in the 1950s, but she recognized it from plans she had studied: thick brick walls, narrow arched windows, and a foundation known for its tricky, uneven stonework. Yet here, on the right-hand side of the frame, she noticed a subtle irregularity, a dark rectangular recess beneath the lowest window, half covered by a vendor's burlap sack. It was not a cellar vent, not an architectural flourish, and not large enough to be a service entrance. It was simply wrong. The shadows inside it appeared deeper than those cast by the surrounding stalls, and the mortar lines surrounding the brickwork were misaligned, as if the opening had been created in haste or concealed afterward. When she showed the photograph to her colleague, historian Malcolm Price, he immediately recognized the implications. Markets in the early 20th century were heavily regulated. Any unregistered alteration to a municipal structure would have violated city codes. "If that's what I think it is," he murmured, leaning in, "someone built a room where no room was meant to exist." Together, they began combing through the building's official blueprints, which documented every stall, storage area, and drainage corridor. Not a single drawing mentioned a chamber or passageway corresponding to the shadowed void in the photograph. Their first theory was mundane but plausible. Perhaps the market workers had constructed a small storage alcove without permission. But an alcove would not require the kind of brick disturbance visible in the image. Nor would it explain the placement too low for practical use, too concealed for convenience. Another possibility surfaced: a provisional shelter space used by impoverished laborers during harsh winters. But city ordinances at the time imposed strict penalties for unauthorized overnight stays within government-owned buildings. If such a space existed, it would have been intentionally hidden from inspectors. Eleanor widened the photograph digitally, though the original resolution was limited. The surrounding vendors appeared unaware of the recessed opening, focused instead on organizing barrels and crates. None of them looked toward it, not even indirectly. It was as if the space existed outside their awareness, present, yet unacknowledged. She noted the tension in one vendor's posture, a man in a frayed apron, shoulders hunched, hands buried in his pockets, standing uncomfortably close to the building's wall. His gaze was fixed downward, toward the cobblestone, rather than toward the bustling street. The more they studied the photograph, the clearer the central question became: why would a busy municipal market in 1909 require a hidden, unregistered interior space, one so carefully placed behind improvised cover that only a single angle frozen in time revealed its existence? And if such a space existed, who used it? Theories began to multiply, but none satisfied the mounting sense of unease. Something about the photograph implied secrecy not for convenience, but for protection, either of those inside the concealed room, or of those who were never meant to know what it contained. The dramatic trigger arrived when Malcolm discovered a faint marking on the brickwork, 3 small scratches forming a symbol he recognized from labor protest documents of that era, a mark used quietly by workers to indicate danger or restricted access. It was almost invisible, tucked close to the dark recess, easily overlooked. But once he pointed it out, Eleanor felt the first shiver of true suspicion. The mystery was deeper than a simple architectural anomaly. The photograph was not just documenting a market, it was preserving a warning. The photograph became the centerpiece of a deeper technical investigation once Eleanor and Malcolm submitted it to the Archives Conservation Lab. Under raking light, the print revealed surface impressions from the original camera plate, fine scratches, slight warping, and edges where the developer had pooled unevenly. These chemical traces confirmed the photo's authenticity and established its provenance firmly in 1909. But the recess in the brickwork behaved differently under the same scrutiny. Its shadows appeared denser, more matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Conservation specialist Dr. Ruth Kearney noted that the tonal values inside the opening did not match the natural fall-off expected from early photographic emulsions. "Whatever's in there," she said softly, "it isn't just darkness. It's something deeper than the lens was meant to capture." Architectural records from the era arrived next, revised blueprints, inspector's notes, and a handful of maintenance logs. Malcolm spread them across a long oak table, cross-referencing each revision with the market's known expansions. The building had undergone minor repairs in 1907 and 1908, cracked masonry, a drainage correction, reinforcement of the lower wall, but none of these explained why fresh brick would have been laid in precisely the place shown in the photograph. A small notation in the margin of the 1908 inspection sheet caught his attention. "Irregularities observed near east wall, further check deferred." The signature belonged to an inspector known for his uncompromising thoroughness. A deferred inspection from him was an anomaly in itself. To understand worker life within the market, Eleanor combed through period newspapers. The Boston Globe and Advertiser described the Haymarket district as noisy, cramped, and often chaotic, but never dangerous. Yet she found several articles detailing tension between market vendors and the city's Board of Health over unsanctioned shelters reportedly built into municipal structures. These makeshift spaces were said to house itinerant workers, or occasionally children who worked seasonal shifts unloading produce carts. None of the reports included addresses, but the descriptions were uncanny. One article mentioned concealed cavities in brick storefront foundations. Another referred to unregistered resting hollows for overnight labor. Meanwhile, Dr. Kearney's spectral imaging revealed faint line work on the right side of the recess marks, invisible under normal light. They formed a curved indentation that looked suspiciously like the outline of a hinge, though the recess appeared bricked over in the photograph. If true, it meant the brickwork had once swung open like a hidden hatch. That discovery shifted the investigation dramatically. They were no longer dealing with a passive void, but a former entry point, one someone had taken pains to seal. Eleanor pursued oral histories next, tracking down descendants of families who had worked in the market during the early 1900s. Most had heard nothing unusual, but one interview changed the entire tone of the inquiry. Margaret Halley, granddaughter of a produce hauler, recalled her grandmother warning her father never to linger along the market's eastern wall. "She said the city used it for things nobody was supposed to see," Margaret explained. She never specified what, only that some boys went missing one winter and the market wasn't the same after. Her voice trembled as she repeated a phrase her grandmother had whispered. There were rooms nobody talked about and doors nobody opened twice. The investigators' growing suspicion clashed with the silence of official records. Every city document insisted the market's lower level contained only storage alcoves and drainage access. Yet one scanned microfilm reel, an incident report from February 1910, described a patrol officer hearing muffled voices from beneath the market floor, though no individuals were located upon inspection. The report was marked closed with no additional detail. A frustrating dead end emerged when Eleanor attempted to identify the vendors in the photograph through employment rosters. The names recorded for that winter did not match the faces in the image. Either the roster was incomplete, or the individuals depicted were not officially registered workers at all. Enlarging the image again, he noticed that the vendor closest to the recess had a faint smudge near his boot, a disturbed corner of mortar lying loose on the cobblestone. It suggested the brickwork had recently been manipulated. And behind the man's stance, barely visible, was a sliver of vertical alignment running deeper into the wall, a suggestion of a chamber extending farther than the foundation plans allowed. In that moment, the investigation shifted from architectural curiosity to human mystery. Whoever built the hidden room had done so quickly. Whoever used it had done so secretly. And whoever sealed it had wanted it forgotten. As the investigation advanced, the photograph ceased to be a simple historical artifact and became a doorway, one that opened not into the past itself, but into the forgotten human lives that occupied its margins. The sealed recess in the brick wall no longer appeared to be an architectural quirk. Everything pointed toward intentional concealment. The hinge outline detected through imaging, the loose mortar near the vendor's boot, the mismatched building records, and the warnings passed quietly between generations of market workers. Still, the researchers lacked a definitive link between the hidden entry and the people who had once moved through the Haymarket's crowded arteries. That connection emerged when Eleanor uncovered a ledger misfiled within a box labeled Sanitary Compliance. The book contained lists of individuals fined for infractions such as overnight, storage violations, or operating without a proper vendor's license. Most names were unknown, but a cluster of them, all recorded during the winter of 1909, shared a peculiar annotation, a single letter R beside each entry. No key defined its meaning. Yet scattered marginalia suggested something more troubling. The city may have quietly tolerated a small workforce of adolescent boys who unloaded early morning shipments before official market hours, boys whose names never appeared on payroll records. If these youths needed a place to rest or hide, it would explain the creation of an unauthorized interior room. At the same time, Malcolm located a personal diary in the descendants' materials Margaret had provided. It belonged to her great-grandmother, Lydia Halley, and although most entries concerned the daily grind of market life, one passage stood out. She described a bitter night in December 1909, when two young haulers sought refuge from the cold, but were told by senior workers to keep away from the east wall, unless you're ready to disappear like the others. Lydia wrote that she dismissed it as rough humor until she heard quiet scuffling behind the bricks a week later, followed by silence so absolute it felt deliberate. Her entry ended with a line that tightened Malcolm's breath. Someone built that place for reasons the city didn't want to name. The discovery pushed Eleanor back to the initial photograph, to the vendor whose posture had always seemed unsettled. She re-examined his expression with fresh context. His shoulders weren't hunched in exhaustion, they were tense, protective, as if shielding the concealed hatch behind him. The downward gaze no longer read as fatigue, but as fear of drawing attention. She zoomed deeper into the grain. His boot, nearly touching the disturbed mortar, had a faint dusting of brick powder, suggesting he had recently handled the concealed panel. The photograph captured not just the structure, but a moment. Someone caught in the act of safeguarding what lay behind the wall. Yet the most decisive evidence came from a source neither of them expected. While reviewing the 1910 municipal budget records online, Malcolm noticed an unaccounted-for expenditure labeled simply Secured Relocation Effort Market District. It was a small sum, but its timing coincided exactly with the rumored disappearances Lydia mentioned. A further document clarified that the expenditure funded temporary housing and vocational reassignment for minors removed from unsuitable conditions. No location was specified, but the reference strongly implied that children had indeed been living or hiding within the market building. Taken together, the clues formed a trajectory too consistent to ignore. The hidden room was not a storage alcove, nor an inspector's oversight. It was a covert refuge created by laborers to shield vulnerable youths from winter exposure and from the harsh enforcement of city regulations. But the secrecy had consequences. When officials finally discovered the space, the boys were removed without public explanation. Their relocation masked as an administrative effort. The market's eastern wall was sealed before dawn the next day, and vendors were warned to forget what they had seen. The emotional weight of this revelation settled heavily on Eleanor. The photograph had preserved a moment of tension between vulnerability and survival, a moment made visible only because the camera had captured the exact angle needed to reveal the recess before it was lost to history. The secret room did not merely exist. It had sheltered children whose lives were shaped by labor practices the city preferred not to acknowledge. And now, more than a century later, their presence emerged from the shadows of a single frame, demanding recognition they had never received. In the weeks that followed, the meaning of the photograph settled into sharper focus. The hidden room, once a vague shadow in a century-old print, had become an undeniable testament to the people who endured the margins of early 20th century urban life. Eleanor found herself returning repeatedly to the image, drawn not only to the recess itself but to the quiet choreography surrounding it, the careful placement of crates, the vendor's tense posture, the attempt to shield a space that had protected children no one else would protect. The photograph was not simply evidence, it was an act of witnessing. And now, more than 100 years later, it was demanding that someone finally heed what it had tried to preserve. When the researchers presented their findings to the Archives Review Committee, the room fell into a heavy silence. No one had anticipated that an unmarked envelope would reveal a forgotten chapter of Boston's labor history. The committee requested a formal report, and Eleanor and Malcolm compiled every detail: the architectural inconsistencies, the municipal expenditures, the oral histories, the ledger of miners, and Lydia Hale's diary entry that described the voices behind the brick. The conclusion was careful but firm. The market's eastern wall had concealed a clandestine refuge for underage haulers, built out of necessity and desperation by workers who understood that those boys had no alternative. It was a room that existed only because the city refused to acknowledge the needs of the people who kept its markets operating. As the researchers continued their work, community organizations reached out, hoping to trace the fates of the displaced children. Most archival trails ended abruptly. A few boys reappeared years later in census records as laborers in other districts. Others vanished into institutions whose paperwork had long since deteriorated. But the larger outcome became clear. The discovery forced a re-evaluation of how Boston remembered its own past. Historians who had once viewed the Haymarket District through the lens of commerce and immigration now recognized the undercurrents of exploitation that shaped daily life there. The photograph had reopened a conversation that had been sealed shut just as tightly as the brickwork itself. The market stall vendor captured in the image became an emblem of this reckoning. Although his identity remained uncertain, his presence turned into a symbol of the people who bore silent witness to injustices they lacked the power to confront. Local educators began referencing the photograph in lessons about child labor, urban poverty, and the hidden architectures of survival created by working-class communities. Museums expressed interest in exhibiting the original print, contextualizing it within a broader history of improvised shelters used in North American cities during that era. What had once been a forgotten picture became a narrative fulcrum, an object capable of reshaping historical memory. For Eleanor, the emotional aftermath carried a weight she had not anticipated. She found herself thinking about the boys who sought warmth behind that wall, imagining their breaths clouding in the cold air as they slipped through the makeshift opening. She wondered whether any of them had sensed that the refuge was temporary, that the world outside would eventually force them back into its rigid expectations. The photograph, in its stillness, held them in that fleeting moment between danger and shelter, a space both precarious and profoundly human. When the archives finally restored and digitized the image for public release, the response was immediate. Former market families wrote in with memories, some fragmented, others vivid. Historians requested access to the full report. Local newspapers ran features exploring the newly uncovered chapter of the city's past. What emerged was not closure, because the fates of the boys could never be fully known, but an acknowledgement that something important had finally been brought to light. In the end, the hidden room beneath the market no longer existed in brick and mortar, but its story lived on through the photograph, through the people who rediscovered it, and through a renewed understanding of how ordinary places often contain the quiet traces of extraordinary struggles. The image remained as it had always been, a single moment of truth captured by chance, revealing a secret that demanded to be remembered.